Hey there, Radioheads. Welcome to another episode of Radio KBE. I am back home, so you can see the nice, beautiful black backdrop that I have here. It's nice to be back home and just back to a normal setting. So, today's episode, I wanted to discuss a couple of rumors that have come out just in the past couple of days from Mark Stein and just kind of some of the stuff we saw after we had like a whole week of Indiana and just how much it would cost for the Lakers to trade with Indiana and stuff like that. And if you guys remember last time, I said whatever Indiana is asking for is very unrealistic, and I don't think the Lakers are going to do anything like that. I don't think anybody's offering those kind of picks. But we have heard just some similar. We have heard some like different news sort of come out, and one of the things that we've heard is actually two specifically different sources. One of them is the Knicks reaching out to the Lakers in regards to swapping Julius Randle for Russell Westbrook, and so that was one story. And then one of the other stories that came out, which I'm actually kind of not surprised about, but I think is interesting to think about it, and it's the Jazz have also called about Westbrook's contract, and as of recording this today, Russ left Wasserman, or he left Thad Foucher, whatever his former agent's name was, and he's just, as of today, he's signed with Jeff Schwartz of XL Sports Management, and so he's got an agent again, and so this saga just kind of continues, and we're still in a holding pattern. But the reason why I wanted to record an episode today was because I wanted to discuss the interesting part about the Knicks being rumored to have conversations with the Lakers, and then also I wanted to talk about just kind of why the Jazz are also reaching out in regards to it. So I'm going to, for this episode, I'm going to split it apart, right? The two topics that we're going to talk about, because I think one of the things that's really interesting is I think the Lakers are being, I think the information that's going out that's piecemeal, actually, if you put the pieces together, it kind of reveals just sort of what actually may be happening. And this is something I talked about a few episodes ago, that there aren't that many singular large expiring contracts out there for teams to make moves with, or teams that are willing to give up. And there's especially not big, large expiring contracts that won't return, that don't involve somebody, the team that has expiring contract asking for a first rounder. Historically, when you have a large expiring contract in the history of the league, doesn't matter who you are, whatever it is, a team that wants cap relief will typically send the pick out for that large expiring so they can get out of certain contracts. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, because I think that's because of what I'm about to talk about. So let's talk about the Jazz first. The Jazz are very clearly rebuilding. I don't know. I'm surprised nobody said anything about it. But last season, the Jazz went and got Eric Paschall, who is Donovan Mitchell's best friend. And if you've been paying attention to the news at all, Eric Paschall signed a two-way contract, not a regular season contract, not anything else. He signed a two-way contract with the Minnesota Timberwolves. This is after the Rudy Gobert trade. This is after the Jazz traded Royce O'Neal to the Nets for just a first rounder. It is very clear that the Jazz are going to move Donovan Mitchell. That's just me looking at the things that have just happened. That's just my speculation. If it happens, if it doesn't happen, I don't know. But it honestly does seem like it's going in that direction. And then for them to let Eric Paschall walk, who is, Donovan's best friend, those sort of things sometimes matter. Like, if you were keeping Donovan, I would imagine Eric would have still been on this team. But it doesn't seem like they're interested in keeping him. And so the reason why they may be reaching out to the Lakers when it comes to everything is because they may be trying to move certain contracts. They may be trying to get to a point where all they have on the roster is expiring contracts. People that they can flip at the trade deadline if they decide to go full tank. This is after a Donovan Mitchell trade. Go full tank and just try and go for a top 4 pick or whatever it may be. So that seems a little straightforward in regards to what it is. And if the asking price from the Jazz is something like just a single first rounder to take on Russ's contract, and then we send back salaries, maybe it's somebody. It's any litany of players that they may have that they may not be interested in. Remember, they made that trade for Rudy Gobert pretty early, and so by the time the guys that they traded for are eligible, or the guys that they brought in, Pat Beverly, Jared Vanderbilt, those sort of players. By the time those guys are eligible to be traded again, it'll be before training camp for the Lakers. So those guys can literally be traded again, walk right into Lakers camp. So if you trade Russ and you trade a first, let's say that's a package that's out there. I think last time I did the video, we sort of discussed that, like, the package that's probably being floated out there, like the most that they'll probably give up is like a protected first and 2 seconds that won't be protected at all. And that seems like a pretty reasonable deal for that size of contract if you're getting back productive players or a star player. And so, that could be any combination of players. It could be Pat Beverly, Bogdanovich, Jared Vanderbilt just switched to clutch. He could be another guy that they could add. And so they can do different things to clear cap. And so some of these guys are, like Pat and Bojan are expiring contracts, but Vanderbilt isn't. And I don't know if he's part of the Jazz future, if they're going to be bottoming out, and they're going to be trading Mitchell. Mike Conley has a little bit more money after this season, an extra $15 million on the books next year. Maybe he's a guy that he gets floated. Same thing with Malik Beasley. Same thing with Jordan Clarkson. These guys have a couple extra years, some extra money that's on there. The total amount of money that they send to the Lakers in terms of this single season, as well as next season, may be much more. And if you guys remember in the last conversation that we had, teams don't look at, and this will apply for the Knicks situation, teams don't look at it just on a year-to-year basis, right? It's not just this guy's a better basketball player than the other guy. That's not the way teams look at these trades. The way they look at these trades is, even if this guy's better than this guy, I have this guy on the books for $120 million more for over the next 4 years, because this league operates based on a salary cap. And so some teams may not want to have to deal with that situation, so they'll be okay with trading away a certain guy, even if there's a slight difference in regards to the basketball value of one versus the other, or even if there's a large difference in the basketball value of one player versus the other. So there's a lot of different things that go into just the situation and stuff like that when it comes to making these sort of decisions. So the Jazz reaching out to the Lakers in regards to that makes sense from hey, we can offload, a grand total of X amount of dollars, which is way more than whatever Russ's single season $47 million is, and we could get a first round in the process. And for the Jazz, they're okay with it because they're going to bottom out. That's their intention, to collect as many picks as they can while they bottom out. And maybe they only hang on to the guys that they know that can gain value and they can flip for more first rounders at the trade deadline or stuff like that. So the only guys that we want to trade now are like the Mike Conleys or the Rudy Gays, like those kinds, the Jared Vanderbilts, who may not necessarily bring back a first rounder at the trade deadline or going into the season. So it'll be interesting to see just kind of what happens. But the logic behind that makes sense. If you're a team that's bottoming out and you're trying to clear salaries, it's the same thing with Indiana. Like Indiana, it might be in the same realm of a team that, clearly they want to get as much as they can. I believe their GM is Kevin Pritchard, who used to be like the Blazers GM before Neil Oshie. I'm sure he doesn't like the Lakers in general, like as, being a GM of a team that was once bounced by them and stuff, by the Lakers previously. So it's just, I understand all the theatrics that are going on behind it, but they're almost in the same situation, right? Same thing with like the Jazz. Like they have all this cap space. They have a couple guys that have long-term contracts. Are they really going to keep them? Do they want to keep them? Can they flip them for first rounders later? Or is this the best deal that they're going to get now? Like those sort of things all matter and stuff like that. So that thing with the Jazz reaching out to us sort of makes sense to some degree. But now the question actually becomes, now the focus actually shifts to the Knicks. Now the Knicks reached out, and I think per Mark Stein was speculated that they were interested in swapping Randall for Russ. So first and foremost, that money is very lopsided, right? So Randall makes, when I'm looking off screen here, I'm just looking at their salaries and stuff like that. So it looks like Randall here only makes $23 million. Russ makes $47 million. So this outgoing salary numbers don't even match. And let me actually pull this up for you guys so you guys can see it. And I'll make myself smaller so we can do this exercise together. So I'll pull myself over here. We'll pull the good old calculator over here. Make it bigger so you guys can see it. All right, perfect. So if we take a look at Randle, so Randle's making $23.7 million. So in order for the Lakers to actually for the Lakers to land, or sorry, not the Lakers, the Knicks to make that trade possible, they'd have to send out, and I think if they're I'm not sure if they're a salary, or well, I guess just because of the salary they're sending out, they'd probably have to send out. You're talking about $37 million more dollars. So Randle, you have to be Randle plus another $14 million because the Knicks don't have cap space to absorb Russ with the difference and stuff like that that's going on. So that conversation didn't make, like, the swap didn't make any sense. The swap does make sense from the perspective of what we just talked about. If you take a look at this number over here, which my face is blocking, Randle is owed $106 million in guaranteed money. 114 probably based on whatever incentives that he hits and stuff like that. That's a lot of money. And that's a lot of money that's dedicated over a long period of time. He signed an extension last season. And so with that being the case, like, what they're essentially offering to do, let's assume that they somehow fill up the $10 million that they need to fill up to make that trade happen. They're exchanging long-term money for short-term money. That's their goal. And that's what they're offering. Maybe there's some pick compensation that's involved. Maybe they don't even need a pick back if they want to swap Russ for Randle and whoever else that they attach to that trade. But it's very, like that's sort of the idea of just kind of how this entire, like, these are how these trades are constructed. In a case like the Jazz, a team that's bottoming out, they may be trying to save as much money as possible while getting as many picks as possible, right? In the case of a team like the Knicks, that's trying to get out of a contract that they feel is really bad, because for them, or maybe if they don't feel that it's bad, it may be a positional thing. Like, they have RJ Barrett on their roster, and they like to play him at the 3. They like to play him at the 4. Sometimes he occupies the same space that Julius Randle likes to occupy on the floor when they're on the floor together. He operates in the same areas offensively that Julius does, and they don't. RJ may complement Randle when Randle has the ball in his hands, but Randle's not necessarily the shooter to complement RJ. So they could be just moving on from that situation. Obviously, they added Jalen Brunson. Some more mouths to feed. And sometimes that can make things difficult, and that's how things change for teams moving forward. Now, I will say that I am very apprehensive at the idea of Julius Randle coming to the Lakers, not because of the fit. I understand the clunkiness of the fit. I'm apprehensive because of who his agent used to be. I'm not sure if he's still his current agent. His agent used to be Aaron Mintz. And if you're a Lakers fan, you recognize that name all too well because, and correct me if I'm wrong, so don't hold it against me, but I'm pretty sure Julius's agent was also D'Angelo Russell's agent, and was also Paul George's agent, and was also Trevor Ariza's agent. And if you're following along, these were all players at some point where something happened or there was some impasse in regards to the contract or an extension, and those players ended up just leaving, or, in Paul George's case, he said he wanted to come to LA, and then he ended up not coming to LA. That was supposed to be the second free agent that the Lakers were supposed to land alongside LeBron the year that we made room for two max spaces. If you remember, Paul George stayed with OKC only to get traded 1 year later to the Clippers along with Kawhi Leonard. And so that entire relationship, and Aaron Mintz is a higher up at CAA. That entire relationship, not necessarily with the front office, but just kind of the way the history of how things have gone with the Lakers, makes me a little apprehensive about whether Julius Randle would actually want to be playing for the Lakers, and whether Aaron Mintz, if he's still his agent, or CAA in general, would want one of their clients in LA. And I'm sure a lot of people are like, oh, well, why does that matter? Well, it's business, and that does matter. This is not 2K. You can't ignore the human part of basketball, and that is a big deal. That's something that makes me a little apprehensive about what is happening. So it sort of got me thinking, because I thought, not that it was strange, but I thought it was interesting. I thought it was interesting that both the Jazz and the Knicks inquired along, in regards to the same player. And if you've been watching my videos, the reason why I find it, you'll already know which direction I'm going in. The reason why I find it interesting is because I think both of those teams are trying to use Russell Westbrook's expiring extension as a way to facilitate a Donovan Mitchell trade. As of right now, the Jazz, if they're going to move Mitchell, we know the Knicks want him really bad. We know the Knicks have a ton of picks that are available. They have 4 of their own, and they have 4 that they got doing other trades around the league. We've heard that, just through the grapevine, that there are, like the Jazz want a really, really huge haul, like, 6 picks or 7 picks or something like that. And I think the interesting part about this entire situation is that if you look at this cap sheet that you're looking at right now that's in front of you, the Knicks do not have any expirings that they're willing to trade. They don't even have expirings that they can trade. If you look at the sheet, Brunson just got signed, Fournier still has an extra year, Mr. Robinson just extended, Derrick Rose has extra years, RJ Barrett, obviously they're not trading, Isaiah Hartenstein they just signed. The Jazz don't actually have the expiring contracts the Knicks don't actually have the expiring contracts that the Jazz would want. So the only way the Knicks would be able to make this trade possible is they'd have to trade one of their large salaries. And the large salary that they probably have to trade would be Julius Randle. So there could be a situation here where the Jazz or the Knicks are offering the Jazz Randle in exchange for Donovan Mitchell, because they have to make the salaries match somehow. And then they'll throw in whatever, 5 or 6 picks that they want. But the issue is that the Jazz don't want Randle. And so the Knicks are probably trying to call the Lakers. And now we're in full conspiratorial mode, right? So this is just me guessing out loud. And I always like doing this on video, because I get comments and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, or that doesn't make sense. So you guys can tell me in the comments on the video whether this makes sense or not. I think if the Kyrie option is not available, which I think is available, I just think the Lakers have to wait. But if the Kyrie option isn't available, I think both teams, the Knicks and the Jazz, will call the Lakers to see if they'd be willing to move Russ's large expiring contract to the Jazz, and that they'll take, and the Lakers in return, and maybe a protected first round pick or whatever it is, and maybe the Lakers will take on players from both the Jazz and the Knicks. And I've been trying to figure out, for the Jazz, it's very clear. They have role players that have played deep playoff runs. So you have Bogdanovich, you have Pat Beverly, you have, let's pull up some other names, right? Like, you have Bogdanovich, you have Pat Beverly, you have Mike Conley, Jordan Clarkson's played once before. Beasley, I don't think he's had a deep run. But if you could find a combination of, let's say, Bogdanovich, Pat Beverly, and let's say Jared Vanderbilt, right? Because you want to somehow incentivize the Lakers to help the Jazz out. And Bogdanovich and Beverly may not be necessarily just it, for the Lakers. That may not be enough of a reason for them to do that versus, moving Russ in a different direction. And Vanderbilt just signed with Clutch. Maybe they take those 3 guys. And if we take those 3 guys, we're looking at roughly about, so let's say, with Russ, if you send out Russ, you can take on up to $59 million in return. If you send out Russ and Wenyen Gabriel or Stanley Johnson, that number gets to about $61 million or something like that, $62 million that you can take on in total in return. So there's 47 plus 48, no, so it's 49. Sorry, And I'm just doing math here so that we can kind of do it together. So let's see, if we add up everybody's salaries here, we got 19.55 for Boyan. Let's say you got another 13 for Pat Beverly. So you've got about $32.5 million. Now, the Jazz have to send out, in order to take on Russ's contract, they have to send out about $37 million for that to make that. So a guy like Jared Vanderbilt at 4.374 may not necessarily be enough. But let's just say if somehow they manage to send us a $5 million player or something like that. Let's say it's Rudy Gay or something like that they send to us, and we hit that number. So now at this point, you're at about $37 million. The Lakers are at about $37 million that they've taken on, and the grand total amount of money may be more. And they've sent Russ and the first rounder to the Jazz. So the Jazz have sent out some players, and the Lakers now have those players, and they've sent out Russ. And so now that large expiring's there, all the Knicks have to do is send out enough outgoing salary to be able to take on Donovan Mitchell's contract, right? So Donovan Mitchell's contract is only $30 million. And this is much harder to do when I'm explaining it to you guys. Obviously, it would be much easier to map it out and put it in a nice Excel sheet. But whenever I do that, people get really mad at me, especially on Twitter and stuff like that. So what I'll do is I'll add it in as part of the writing companion, because nobody on Twitter actually reads anything off of Twitter other than you guys, because you really care about Lakers basketball, and that's why this channel is got the subscribers it does. So I'll add it as a writing companion, what the trade would actually look like. But in order for the Knicks to get Donovan Mitchell, they would have to send out $24 million. And so we know that the Lakers sent out the largest guy, $47, $49 million, whatever it is. So we know Lakers can bring back close to $60 million. And we know that the Jazz only need to send out, because they're only taking on expirings, they've sent out enough salary in order to satisfy their version of the trade. Obviously, they have to send something small to the Knicks because that's just how the rules work. But we know the Lakers are good. We know the Jazz are good. So now the Knicks are the only team that have to send out about $24 million in order to make a trade happen. So again, remember, the Jazz don't necessarily, they may be like, hey, we don't want to take on any salary. We don't want to pay for anybody. We're going straight to the bottom. Just send us all the picks, the 6 first rounders, whatever it is that you guys are going to send us. So maybe the Lakers don't want Julius Randle, right? Julius Randle kind of almost gets you there by himself. Maybe the Lakers say, hey, you know what, send us Evan Fournier instead. And maybe you send us Cam Reddish. So now the Lakers have turned around and they've turned Russ and the first, whether it's protected or not protected, they've turned it into some combination of Evan Fournier, Cam Reddish, Pat Beverly, maybe Bogdanovich, maybe Malik Beasley, maybe some combination of players that equals out to. Obviously, the Lakers would have to send out, you'd have to send out a small salary to a team like the Knicks, because again, you have to make sure that you send something to each team that's part of the process. But that's sort of how you get to a point where the Lakers send Russ out and then bring back a bunch of role players. And now, when you add Bogdanovich, you add Pat, you add Cam Reddish, you add Evan Fournier, now you've got a whole bunch of shooting that's on this roster that matches up and balances out all the blue-collar athletes that you have on the roster. So now you're not relying on Troy Brown to have to be this knockdown shooter. And the best part of this sort of situation is, if this is an alternative to what to a trade for Kyrie, essentially what happens is you still can move guys like Talon, Nunn, and aggregate them up, right? And obviously the tax and stuff like that'll matter. We don't know what the upper limit is for the Lakers of how much they're willing to spend in tax and stuff like that. But that's a situation that's very interesting. And that's a pretty damn good alternative. And like I said, I'll add it in the written companion. But the way to essentially think of it is them being facilitators and taking on. And remember, many of these contracts that they would be taking on are just 1 to 2 year contracts, outside of the really young players. Like if they take on Vanderbilt and Cam Reddish, like those guys are on still their rookie scale contracts. Eventually they'll get extensions. But it helps push the timeline and build to the youth movement. The interesting part about the Cam Reddish Vanderbilt thing is they're both clutch clients. So I would imagine Rich Paul would be trying to steer his clients to the Lakers, because that's what the Lakers have been doing. They just keep adding all the role players, the guys that want to kind of build their value and make use of Laker fans, that just kind of gas up the value of the players that they have, so that those guys can get paid. And that's the interesting part. So that's an alternative that's available. And I suspect that may be something that's going on. I think both the Knicks and the Jazz are separately probably trying to reach out to see how they can make that happen. Maybe they're trying to make the Russ trade happen and then re-aggregate him again. The Knicks are trying to do it separately, so it's just a 1-to-1 with the Jazz. But that's where the Lakers can kind of fit in and squeeze themselves into this sort of situation and then try to come out in a place where it works out for them. It's not a situation where the Jazz would be like, oh, we really don't want to help the Lakers, because the Jazz are going in the opposite direction. Their timeline is different from what ours is. And for the Knicks, they would land the guy that they really want in Donovan Mitchell. And, obviously they'd have to figure out what they're going to do with Randall if they end up moving him. But in that process, the Lakers end up helping them out by sending maybe a protected first-round pick to the Jazz. So that kind of stuff matters. And I think a trade like that probably involves a lot of creativity, a lot of good relationships to make it all work. But it's not impossible. It's just a matter of, figuring out how it works. Salary-wise, it could work. And objective-wise, if the Knicks' goal is to get Mitchell and the Jazz goal is to get as many picks as possible and get an only roster expirings and cut any long-term salary that they may have, sort of a win-win. And for the Lakers, if they want to try and maximize the amount of role players, maybe playoff-tested role players, to put around Anthony Davis and LeBron, and this is obviously in case a Kyrie trade doesn't work out, that might be the right move. If both parties, if both the Knicks and the Jazz are interested. The Lakers should really function as a facilitator to make that trade happen and come out in a situation where they have the depth and the shooting and the more balance that they need in their roster. So I'm going to be really interested to see how it goes, and I'll try to mock up a something in the written companion for you guys to read so you can actually visualize what it looks like. But that's it's been interesting to see that news, those two teams get mentioned like that, because individually I can see it, but when you combine what they've been rumored for, you could see how the Lakers sort of fit into that situation, being a team that's willing to take on salary, longer term salary. And, obviously LeBron's extension is coming up, so that's going to matter too as well. But if he extends for the 1+1, the Lakers know what their timeline is. They've got additional 2-year timeline to figure out how they can win, their second championship during his tenure here. And, if you line some of that stuff up, Darvin Ham has said that what he really wants out of Russ, if Russ is on this roster, is he wants a pit bull on defense. And if Russ isn't on this roster, then who better to have as a pit bull on defense than Patrick Beverley? That's literally what he's known for. And so you can see how some of that stuff sort of lines up in a cosmic basketball way. And you could see situations where a player you could run a lineup. Obviously, we're in fantasy land, but I could see a lineup of Pat Beverley, Evan Fournier, LeBron, Anthony Davis, and let's say Thomas Bryant actually working out pretty well, and with good defensive balance, some good shooting surrounded, and Fournier was, if you guys remember one of the previous episodes I did, he's one of those high Q shooters I was mentioning, a guy who can function both as in a catch and shoot role, and he can also function as like a traditional two guard where you run sets coming off of pin downs, using him in PNR and that sort of stuff. And he has good size on him. You think he's about 6'6", 6'7". So, that would be a pretty good trade. So I'll mock something up in the written companion to this episode, and you guys can have something a little bit more visual to look at. But that was really interesting. I think there is definitely something interesting going on with just kind of those two teams reaching out to us. Because remember, they weren't the two teams that were originally mentioned, but you have heard that, it's basically a waiting game and there's an impasse. And I'm sure there's other teams that are also interested in Donovan Mitchell, a team like Miami and stuff like that. They may call the Lakers too for the same exact reason. Kyle Lowry still has another year, and the Jazz may not want his salary. Duncan Robinson, not necessarily as valuable. You know, he's a valuable basketball shooter and stuff like that, but not as valuable as people, would think he would be and stuff like that around the league because of his defensive limitations and stuff like that. So it's interesting. There is an opportunity if the Kyrie route doesn't work out, where the Lakers can function as a facilitator for teams that are trying to land Donovan Mitchell. Or if there's a team out there that decides, hey, you know what, we're just going to bottom out. We just want expiring contracts and take on those salaries. But obviously LeBron's extension will be a big part of making that decision. Once the Lakers know for sure what his extension looks like, they'll go from there. I would imagine it'll probably be the 1+1 if he does take an extension. But it'll be very interesting. And the report did come out that LeBron's extremely happy in LA, and I think Mark Stein reported that. So that was really good. And so it'll be interesting to see what they do. But I wouldn't put it past anybody, either of those teams to do it. And I know Danny Ainge is the Boston guy, but he works for Utah now, and it wouldn't make sense for him to be, to stop them from doing their initiatives. That's not why or else they probably wouldn't have brought him on there to begin with if he's not going to do what's best for that team and what direction they want to go in. So I'll be interested in seeing what happens and what direction they go in, and I'll make sure I write the written companion. As always, if you guys can like it, share it, like the videos, it helps that Google or the YouTube algorithm. If you like it more, then YouTube's like, oh yeah, we'll share this more and set it up as a video. So it helps on YouTube. Many of you guys have already subscribed. Encourage your friends to subscribe if they like smarter Lakers content and nuanced content. And if you could share it on Twitter, I appreciate it a lot. This has always been a wonderful experience, and I'm always glad to do it this way because it's just more fun. And, I appreciate all the comments that I get. I read everything. And so I try to make sure that I respond to everybody, that asks a question and stuff like that. So as always, I appreciate you guys watching. And if nothing else, I'll see you guys in the next video. Take it easy.